14 submarines, 28 crews. And by design, roughly half of the sailors who serve on any given one of those submarines will finish an entire career without ever meeting the other team that sails the exact same boat. That's not an accident, and it isn't secrecy for its own sake. According to the U.S. Navy, every Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine is assigned 2 complete, separate crews, designated blue and gold, who alternate command of the same vessel roughly every 3 months. One crew is at sea on deterrent patrol. The other is home, training, on leave, or getting ready to take the boat back out. They swap. The submarine, in a sense, never really goes home. So here's the question this video is going to answer. Why would the Navy build a system where 2 full crews are trained, paid, and qualified to run the same multi-billion-dollar submarine, and then structure it so those 2 crews barely overlap? The answer goes back to a Cold War math problem that had nothing to do with secrecy and everything to do with keeping enough nuclear-armed submarines at sea at all times without building more submarines than the country could afford. Let's start with what the 2-crew system actually is, because blue and gold sounds almost casual for something this consequential. Each Ohio-class submarine, there are 14 of these ballistic missile boats currently in the fleet, home-ported at Naval Submarine Base Kings Bay in Georgia and Naval Base Kitsap in Washington State has a blue crew and a gold crew, each with its own commanding officer, its own executive officer, and its own full roster of roughly 150 sailors. Both crews are independently qualified to operate the submarine. Neither is a backup or a training crew. They are, for all operational purposes, 2 separate navies assigned to one hull. The rotation works like this. One crew takes the submarine out on what the Navy calls a strategic deterrent patrol, typically lasting somewhere between 70 and 90 days submerged. When that patrol ends, the boat returns to port, and during a turnover period, a few weeks of maintenance, resupply, and handoff briefings, the other crew takes over. That crew goes out on the next patrol while the first crew stands down, retrains, and eventually gets ready to do it again. The submarine itself barely idles. The crews do the resting. The boat keeps working. Now here's the problem that made this necessary in the first place, and it's worth slowing down on, because it's really a personnel problem wearing a military uniform. Back in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when the Navy was standing up its first ballistic missile submarines under the Polaris program, planners ran into an uncomfortable constraint. A submarine with a single crew can only stay at sea so long before fatigue, morale, and basic human endurance become the limiting factor, not the machine, the people. Send a boat out, bring it all the way home, give the crew a long stand down, then send that same crew back out, and you lose a huge chunk of the submarine's useful time to transit and reset. A single crew warship might historically spend somewhere around 1/4 to 1/3 of its time actually on station, with the rest eaten up by transit, upkeep, and crew rest. For an attack submarine or a destroyer, that trade-off is tolerable. For a submarine whose entire strategic purpose is to stay unfindable and available around the clock as part of the nation's nuclear deterrent, it's a serious liability. The whole point of a ballistic missile submarine, commonly shortened to SSBN, is that an adversary can never be sure where it is or whether it could be located and destroyed before it responds. If those submarines spent most of their time in port for crew turnover, that guarantee weakens considerably. The 2-crew solution split the difference between the machine and the men. Keep the same number of hulls, but stop tying a submarine's operational tempo to a single crew's endurance. According to Navy and Congressional Research Service accounts of the program's history, this dual-crew concept was adopted essentially from the start of the Polaris fleet and has carried through every generation since, Polaris to Poseidon to Trident and now Ohio-class. I spent a while going through public Navy fact sheets and congressional reporting on this program, and one detail kept nagging at me. Nowhere is the 2-crew system described as a workaround. It's treated as foundational, built into how these submarines were meant to be used from day one, not bolted on later to fix a scheduling headache. So the origin problem gets solved. 14 hulls can sustain something close to continuous coverage instead of the low utilization rate a single crew model would produce. That's the historical piece. But solving the math problem created a second, much less obvious problem. One that has nothing to do with missiles or patrol schedules and everything to do with how you hand a warship from one commanding officer to another without losing a single thread of what that submarine knows, needs, or is tracking. That handoff is where the never meet part of this story actually lives. And it's worth being precise about what that means, because it's easy to make it sound more mysterious than it is. Blue and gold crew members aren't forbidden from crossing paths. Sailors on both crews are stationed at the same base, train in overlapping facilities, and in a small submarine community, plenty of individuals know their counterparts personally. What the Navy describes is that the crews, as complete units, generally don't serve together aboard the submarine at the same time. The turnover between patrols is short and businesslike, a compressed window built around briefings, equipment checks, and written and recorded handoff material, not a shared voyage where one crew shows the other the ropes in real time. That compression is deliberate, and it's the second obstacle this system had to solve. How do you transfer everything a crew has learned about a nuclear-powered warship's current material condition, its maintenance status, its sonar picture of the ocean environment it just patrolled, and dozens of other operational details without weeks of overlap to lean on? The Navy's answer, going by public descriptions of submarine turnover procedures, is a structured handoff process built around detailed logs, maintenance records, and standardized briefings, refined over 6 decades of doing exactly this twice a year on every SSBN in the fleet. It isn't glamorous. It's closer to an extremely rigorous shift change procedure than anything out of a spy thriller. But it has to work perfectly every time, because the crew coming aboard is about to take sole responsibility for a submarine carrying some of the most powerful weapons in the American arsenal. What's most surprising here, once you sit with it, isn't the secrecy angle. There isn't much secrecy to it at all. It's publicly described Navy doctrine. What's surprising is the scale of what's being duplicated to make it work. This isn't 2 people splitting a job. It's 2 complete command structures, 2 full sets of qualified watchstanders, 2 independent crews of roughly 150 sailors each, trained to the same exacting standard for every one of 14 submarines. That's the personnel footprint of 28 separate warship crews, maintained so that 14 hulls can behave, in terms of availability, like a much larger fleet. Here's what this tells us about how the Navy actually thinks about nuclear deterrence. The credibility of the system was never just about the missiles or the submarines themselves. It was about guaranteeing presence, making sure that at any given moment, a meaningful portion of that fleet is submerged, on patrol, and effectively unlocatable, regardless of how tired any individual crew might be. The hardware is only half the deterrent. The scheduling discipline behind it is the other half, and it's the part that almost never gets talked about. Now, a bit of general context worth pausing on, because it explains a lot about why this whole system exists. An Ohio-class SSBN is a large vessel, displacing on the order of 18,000 tons submerged, longer than 1.5 football fields, built around a mission that's almost entirely passive. Unlike an attack submarine, whose job includes hunting other vessels, an SSBN's primary job during a deterrent patrol is to stay hidden, stay ready, and be available to launch its submarine-launched ballistic missiles only if ordered to as part of the nation's nuclear command structure. Each of these submarines carries Trident II-D5 missiles in vertical launch tubes. Under New START treaty limits, a portion of each submarine's missile tubes have been deactivated to comply with arms control ceilings, a detail confirmed through treaty verification reporting rather than Navy statements about individual hulls. The strategic value of the submarine is almost entirely about persistence, being present and undetected, which is exactly what the 2-crew rotation is built to maximize. Here's the take that'll probably get some pushback. For a system this consequential, the 2-crew model gets remarkably little public attention compared to the missiles or the submarine's stealth, and that seems backwards. The missiles are impressive engineering, but the actual deterrent value delivered to the country, patrol after patrol, decade after decade, comes disproportionately from an unglamorous human resources system. Recruiting, training, and rotating enough qualified submariners to keep that presence continuous. Take away the crews and their proficiency, and the most advanced submarine in the world is just a very expensive object tied up at a pier. Which raises the second half of this story. What happens when the system doesn't run this smoothly? A short turnover window is efficient when everything goes according to plan. It leaves very little slack when it doesn't. A delayed maintenance item, a training certification running behind schedule, a piece of equipment that fails final checks right before a scheduled patrol. Multiply that pressure across 14 submarines and 28 crews operating on a continuous, decades-long rotation, and you start to see why submarine force readiness is one of the more closely tracked, and by some analysts' account more strained, pieces of the entire U.S. nuclear triad. Put yourself in the shoes of a submarine squadron scheduler for a second. You're not just coordinating one ship's maintenance calendar. You're coordinating 14 hulls, 28 crews, missile tube inspections, reactor refueling overhauls that can take years per submarine, and a requirement from national command authorities that a certain number of boats be on patrol without interruption at all times. There's essentially no room in that schedule for a hull to just sit idle while people figure things out. That's the quiet, unglamorous pressure the two-crew system exists to relieve, and in tighter years, the pressure it can struggle to fully absorb. Would you have guessed that keeping a nuclear deterrent credible depends this heavily on shift-change logistics rather than on the missiles themselves? It's a fair question to sit with, and people genuinely disagree on it. Whether the current fleet of 14 submarines, cycling through 2 crews apiece, gives the Navy enough margin, or whether it's running closer to the edge than most of the public realizes. This isn't a system that's going away either. The Ohio-class boats are aging out over the coming years, and the Navy's replacement program, the Columbia-class submarine, is being built specifically to continue the same 2-crew blue and gold rotation, not to replace it with something else. That continuity says something about how load-bearing the model has proven to be. 6 decades after Polaris-era planners first split submarine crews in 2 to solve an endurance problem, the successor to that entire submarine line is being designed around the same solution. Where this stands today, based on publicly available Navy and defense reporting sources, is fairly simple. The blue and gold 2-crew system remains standard practice across the current Ohio-class SSBN fleet, and it's the confirmed operational model for the incoming Columbia-class boats. What isn't public, and reasonably so given the sensitivity of exact submarine locations and patrol schedules, is precisely how many submarines are on patrol at any given moment, exact turnover durations for individual hulls, or granular readiness statistics beyond what's periodically summarized in unclassified Navy and Government Accountability Office reporting. Anyone citing specific patrol dates or hull-by-hull deployment schedules beyond those general public figures is going well past what's actually been confirmed. There's a line that shows up a lot in the unclassified budget and readiness reporting on this program that's easy to skim past, references to material condition and crew certification backlogs as recurring risk factors for the submarine force. It's dry language, but it's describing exactly the pressure point this video has been circling, the turnover window, and how little slack it leaves. So, back to where we started. 14 submarines, 28 crews, and a rotation system built not out of secrecy but out of a very practical Cold War equation: how to keep a fixed, expensive fleet of nuclear-armed submarines at sea as close to continuously as possible without simply building more of them. The 2 crews that never meet aren't avoiding each other. They're running an extremely tight, extremely well-rehearsed handoff twice a year on every boat in the fleet, so the submarine itself almost never has to stop. We'd love to know what you think. Does a system this dependent on tight scheduling and crew turnover make you more confident in the reliability of the deterrent fleet, or less? There's a lot more in the public record about how the Columbia-class program is trying to preserve this exact model while modernizing everything else about the submarine. We didn't have room to get into the reactor and propulsion changes here, so drop a comment if you want to follow up on that.